Section 3, defining police violence. For this section, we'll talk about the Jim Crow years, police violence defined, an aspect of police brutality. Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. James Baldwin. And this is a depiction of that very same thing, ignorance aligned with power. Individuals that were fighting against their fellow citizens just because they wanted to assert the fact that they are or I am a man. In the Jim Crow years, for African Americans, this was not a reality. This was not an eventual or inalienable right. Jim Crow laws were laws primarily in the South that were used to enforce racial segregation. This period lasted between the end of Reconstruction, 1877, and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. However, others say that the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed race-based discrimination as it relates to religion, sex, or national origin, as the true end to the Jim Crow years. Others who were the victim and still being victimized in the South would say that they did not end after 1964. No colors allowed, and similar things were like that were an example of Jim Crow years. In addition to lynchings as a form of punishment, it is estimated that from 1882 to 1968, about 3,446 African Americans were lynched, which is quite a stark departure from the previous years where African Americans were enslaved and the numbers of lynching were minuscule. Some assert that it is because that African Americans were property and white slave owners did not want to destroy their property. However, after the Civil Rights, the war, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, these slave owners no longer had property. So the bodies, or the black and brown bodies, were no longer worth what it was previously. So lynchings occurred tremendously in the years that followed. Examples of Jim Crow laws. In Oklahoma, telephone booths were segregated. In Mississippi, separate drinking fountains for blacks. In Atlanta, Georgia, African Americans could not swear by the same Bible as whites. In North Carolina, factories were separated by white and black sections. And in Alabama, some towns you could not even play cards with your fellow citizens who were white. What is police violence? Police brutality is a form of unwarranted physical violence perpetrated by an individual or group, symbolically representing a government-sanctioned law enforcement agency as opposed to an individual perpetrator who only represents themselves. Police brutality occurs within the context of police officers possessing privilege and often assume justification for their actions as they have sworn to protect and serve the community. Things to consider. Police are armed and trained to defuse crisis. And there are many examples throughout this country and throughout history where police officers have been called into and have done phenomenal work. And this presentation is not about that. It's not about vilifying the police force, but rather to enlighten and to bring awareness to the fact that many police officers and many police departments are known to cause acts of violence against their citizens, especially African Americans. Many of the police officers, the reason behind these actions are often reported as they are afraid of ethnic minorities. And the same can be said for many white citizens. Our research finds that there's a blue code of silence, whereas officers believe that the acquisition of money and property is more egregious than physically assaulting someone of color. It is easier to side with the perpetrator of trauma because the only thing perpetrators require is silence. Something to think about. Police brutality has a continuum, a force continuum of 5 categories. 5 categories, excuse me. Police presence, verbalization, empty hand control, less than lethal methods, and last but not least, lethal methods. And we've seen many examples of lethal methods, but for the next segment, I want to talk about less than lethal methods, such as on July 18, 2016, Charles Kinsey, a trained special needs caregiver, was helping a client with autism who wandered from the group home where he was later shot. And I want to highlight this because many of us are mental health professionals trained to work with clients who have autism, and many of us are people of color. And as a result of this, in the line of duty, this man, Charles Kinsey, was shot. And if you see this video, which I have added to the section, this individual his hands were up, he was laying on his back, he acknowledged that he was here to support someone, but he was still shot. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a person of color, it is more likely for you to be assaulted or even killed by a police officer as a result of this bias. And we'll talk more about the statistics moving forward. Thank you.